The prominence of carpets in Islamic art is a long-standing tradition and one that is still highly prized today. The infusion of culture that is incorporated within these textiles creates a beautiful visual connection between viewer and artist. Dr. John Thompson's odyssey into the exploration of carpets has gained him significant recognition for his dedication. As he shares his knowledge through his written publications, he allows each one of us to become part of this intimate journey. I am privileged to be able to officially introduce the acclaimed author and scholar, Dr. John Thompson, to you all today. While his diverse career has allowed him to gain an abundance of knowledge in his field, Dr. Thompson is here to specifically share his insight into the significant use of colour within this textile art form. Thank you. Please help me in joining Dr. Thompson to the stage.
Well, that's good. Thank you for that very sweet introduction. It seems to be the custom to be flashed at by the photographer. And since I singularly object to this, I decided I'm going to tell you a little story. It's something that many of you may not be aware of. But in Arthur Upham Pope and Phyllis Ackerman's multi-volume survey of Persian art, which is one of the major reference works for the Islamic art historian, there is a supplementary volume in which there appears a poem which is titled by an unknown 14th century Sufi poet. And the poem is an ode to a garden carpet. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Now, I read this poem, and I thought, from my limited knowledge of Persian Sufi poetry, that this really wasn't up to much. And one day, I was looking at the title, and by the way, it doesn't quote the source of this 14th century poem. Obviously a translation. And as I was looking at the title, I noticed a strange thing. The word An had an italicized A, unknown had an italicized U, and poet had an italicized P. So this actually was a fake poem composed by Arthur Upham Pope and somehow passed off as something authentic. And one scholar by the name Schuyler Cammon actually took this to be a real poem and has somehow polluted the literature on the relationship between carpets and Sufism. Anyway, that over, I'm going to get on with my talk, and I hope that the photos have finished. Now, I admit to being fascinated by carpets. This is the title. The first thing is that I love their abstract power. I also am delighted by their texture and their tactile quality. And carpets also have a sort of primal energy. But above all, I'm delighted by their color. Now, apropos color, I want to make a little personal confession. My first contact with carpets as an adult was when I was a student at university, believe it or not, 50 years ago. I got a job in Turkey during the long summer vacation, where I spent nearly 3 months. And I was a regular visitor to the Istanbul Bazaar, where for some reason I was attracted to carpets. I was taken round the bazaar by a likable rogue who made his living selling fake silver jewelry to tourists. But everything I saw was somehow unsatisfactory. It seemed flat, uninteresting, or simply garish. And it was only much later that I came to understand the nature of my problem. I'd been brought up in a home with wooden floors lain with carpets. And as an infant, I had crawled around on them. And through consistent contact, my brain had become kind of conditioned or accustomed to certain qualities and combinations of colors. Subconsciously, in the Istanbul Bazaar, I was comparing what I saw with a sort of reference set of color images and color combinations, which I didn't find in the carpets shown to me in the Istanbul Bazaar, which seemed to lack a certain magic present in the older carpets, which had been formed through contacts with antique carpets. And I have to tell you that this is a rare sight, because most of the mosques in Turkey, which were formerly lain with multitudes of antique carpets that have been given, have been plundered. So now you can find practically nothing. Now, the problem that I had at that time with the new carpets has fascinated me for years. And only recently have I come really to understand in a more scientific way what the craftsmen and women in times past had worked out and what some modern carpets have lost. And this has given me a deep respect for the skill of those ancient artisans. As soon as I started my first job and began to earn a little money, I don't know why, but that search which had begun in Istanbul was reawakened. Every Saturday, I would go to carpet dealers and to museums to look at carpets. I began to read about the subject, and in this way, I gained a practical knowledge of carpets and learnt something about their background and history. At that time, in the mid-1960s, the fashion was for pallid interiors. People wanted no-color carpets, as the Americans would say, to go with the drapes. And in fact, a profitable business grew up for chemically bleaching carpets to remove their color. And indeed, many good carpets have been ruined in this way. But at the same time, in the 60s, a different movement was growing up in the background. A few bold spirits became interested in brightly colored carpets. And the more colorful, the better. And needless to say, I was among those. As I grew to know carpets better, I was increasingly struck by a curious phenomenon. Some carpets that I found generally attractive seemed to be spoiled by a red color that did not blend with the other colors. Other people had noticed this, and speaking among ourselves, we described it as a hot red. But we couldn't otherwise explain this phenomenon. Now, among the small and growing circle of carpet enthusiasts at that time was a professor of organic chemistry at Bristol University by the name of Mark Whiting, who subsequently did some distinguished works on the analysis of dyes in old carpets. And he was able to establish that this, what we called hot red, was a synthetic dye that had become commercially available in the 1880s. And with a little practice, it became possible to identify this dye by eye, by just simply looking at the carpet. And in due course, we gradually became aware that several other dyes, especially the red dyes, exhibited the same phenomenon. And this included the synthetic dye alizarin. Alizarin produces a clear, bright red. Now, this dye, it was claimed, was merely a synthetic version of the naturally occurring red dye madder, which has already been mentioned, which is obtained from the dried roots of the plant Rubia tinctoria. And this has been in use for centuries. It's been widely traded and was traditionally used for the bright red of military uniforms. Now, if indeed alizarin was merely synthetic matter, why did it appear to be, as we called it, hot? That's to say, it did not blend with its neighboring colors. The problem remained unexplained. Now, in order to take this further, I want to look very briefly at some aspects of the perception of color, which is an extremely complex and sometimes difficult subject, and needless to say, one that I'm not going to go into. The first point to make is that there is no color independent of an observer. There are different wavelengths of light, but the experience of color is a phenomenon that arises in the eye and brain of an observer from the pattern of wavelengths of light received. Just for fun, I want to just show you something. Now, have a look at this image. In the center is a house, which I've ringed around. I want you to fix your eyes on this house while I count for 15 seconds. Okay, off we go. 1, 2, 3. Don't move your eyes. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Keep looking at it and don't move your eyes. And I'm going to count another 6 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now move about. I think you will agree that there is no color in that image. So, that demonstrates what I've just said, that the phenomenon of color is something that is registered in the eye and brain. Now, the human eye has 3 types of cell, which are maximally sensitive at 3 different wavelengths of visible light: short, medium, and long. The receptor cells are not sensitive only to one wavelength, but to all 3 wavelengths, but to differing degree. And it is by comparing the pattern produced by the stimulation of the 3 types of receptor cell that the brain registers color. Now, because the brain registers color by a process of comparison, the context of color is extremely important. The same color appears different in differing surroundings. And the carpet producers in former times certainly understood this. And they used a number of devices for enhancing the visual effect of the colors that were available to them. Just want to show you a little demonstration of this. If you look at these 2 red squares, they are the same, but the apparent intensity of the color varies according to its surroundings. An opposite or complementary color enhances it, whereas a similar color tends to soften it. And this is something that advertisers use, something that has been mentioned by Olga Bush, where you have a similar well, anyway, it's an effect which is enhanced by the fact that the colors are actually opposite or complementary, and the letters are not actually stable and seem to move about. In the carpet world, this is something that is seen in a group of Egyptian carpets, which I should say are notoriously difficult to photograph, where you have a juxtaposition of the complementary colors red and green, one on top of the other. Another enhancement is light and dark contrast. Now, if you look at this, the blue lines are actually all the same, but they appear more intense when surrounded by black. This again is made use of in quite a lot of old Turkish carpets. This is a probably 15th century carpet in the Vakıflar Carpet Museum in Istanbul. Another example, the light pattern is thrown into relief by a contrasting dark background. Another device that's used is the curious phenomenon that outlines add emphasis to blocks of color. Now, this is a very widely used, I should say quite obviously that the two red squares are the same, but the one with the blue outline seems to attract attention and to be more intense. This is a very widely used device which is practical for the weaver and takes the form of what I would call color separation lines, in which neutral colored outlines surround all the motifs. And you can see this in this detail of this 14th century Turkish carpet, in which the pinkish red motifs are all surrounded by a neutral sort of charcoal grey separating them from the surrounding deeper purpley brown. A very important feature of traditionally produced carpets, I should say that there is another better example here. This is again an abstract pattern with blocks of color, each one of which is surrounded by a neutral color, giving emphasis to the blocks of color. Now, a very important feature of traditionally produced carpets is a phenomenon known as abrash. This is a loan word from Arabic into both Turkish and Persian, meaning mottled. Now, when wool is spun by hand, it varies in thickness. And in the dye bath, this allows for an unequal penetration of the dye, or an uneven penetration. And the result is that the color of the pile is never exactly uniform. Minor variations that you can see here in the green and in the orange and also in the red give a sort of life to the color. And I see this as a sort of vibrato in color, similar to the use of vibrato in music, where minor variations in pitch add life to the sound. And this is an effect which is lost in machine-spun yarns, which are of uniform thickness. This is particularly seen in the green, which is double-dyed with both blue and yellow, so that you get a multiplied possibility of color variation. And here is also a wonderful example where this absolutely beautiful deep blue is not actually a uniform color, but is consisting of innumerable minor variations. Now, for a long time, people have been struggling to devise a generally accepted system for defining color. And it's now consistently agreed that there are three main parameters. These were referred to last night by Jonathan. First of all is its hue. That's to say, its spectral wavelength of pattern of light reflected from the surface, which gives it a color that appears red, green, blue, etc. The second is how much light it appears to reflect, which causes a color to appear either light or dark. This is especially used in detecting movement and judging depth. This is something that was referred to by Olga Busch, who referred to it as the where component, as opposed to the what component, is that right? No, the where component as opposed to the what component, that's right. And the third, which is what I want to speak about, is color intensity, vividness, or purity, which is otherwise called saturation. This is the quality which at one extreme allows a color to be described as glowing or brilliant. Now, it came as a great surprise to me when I first came across a carpet some 350 or 400 years old that had somehow been preserved in perfect condition. Its original colours were extraordinarily clear and brilliant. Now, when a carpet is in use, there is some slight but definite fading of the colours over time, and friction on the surface of the carpet's pile flattens it and polishes the wool fibres so that they reflect more light. The overall effect is that the slightly muted colours acquire a lustre which, like the deep polish on a piece of old furniture, is described as patina. And this is seen as something desirable that can only be acquired through time. So, although today we've come to appreciate carpets, old carpets, with their patina of age, the original craftsmen were striving for a somewhat different effect. They were striving to produce works of carpet art using colours that were both highly saturated, but at the same time harmonious. Now here, I find myself in front of a puzzle that has been concerning me for a long time. If you observe a traditional weaving community that is accustomed to working with a range of natural dyes, and observe what happens when they're introduced to the range of modern synthetic dyes now available, you find that within a few short years, old colours are abandoned in favour of the new dyes. The results can be disturbing. There are a range of dye stuffs that have been around for some time now that produce a degree of brilliance or saturation that simply didn't exist before. There are dazzling reds and a particularly disagreeable orange that is widely available. And there are some synthetic greens that are particularly poisonous looking, and they are so stable that they cannot even be removed in the carpet bleaching process. And in fact, in Iran they are used, and the carpet bleachers have taken to painting the colours over with another dye. Well, to give you some examples, here is a lady who is wielding a saddlebag that she has woven herself. It shows you the typical brilliant orange and a somewhat lively green and a very bright red, all synthetic. Probably the blue is the only natural dye. Another example, people weaving a kilim in a tent in Turkey. You see again this very sharp red and the use of my favorite orange. And here again, this is a rather surly-looking gentleman sitting in a tent among the textiles woven by his very talented wife, who certainly had a great love for this orange and red. So once the new colours became available, it seems that the colour harmony that prevailed in the past disappears. So there are two questions here. First of all, what happened to the colour sense of the people using the new dyes? Why is it that in the past there seemed to prevail a wonderful sense of colour harmony that simply vanishes in a few short years as soon as the new colours become available? And the second question is, what is it about the dyes themselves that makes them seem harsh and discordant compared with the traditional dyes? These questions are to some extent linked, but I shall try to address them separately. The first thing to observe is that the world over, people love colour. But how refined is their colour sense? Artistic sensibility, like musical and mathematical skill, is something that can be learned. But I believe that we are born with very unequal degrees of innate sensibility. Simply put, some people are born with much more innate artistic ability than others. And I found an interesting illustration of this in a weaving village in Turkey, where several dozen families were engaged in weaving traditional style carpets using natural dyes. There was only one dyer in the village, so all the weavers were using the same colors. What astonished me was that the great majority of women produced worthy, if somewhat pedestrian, results, yet the work produced by 2 or 3 women was somehow outstanding. They had an unfailing sense of what colors went together, how to juxtapose them, and what relative amounts of each to use. This links with the second question, because in traditional society, dyeing was a specialized craft handed down in families, which ensured that skills were passed from one generation to the next. Some colors require a high level of skill, the dyeing of some colors, and others involve multiple operations spread over several days in which the wool has to be pre-treated before dyeing can begin. Overall, dyeing was expensive, specialized, time-consuming work. On the other hand, the new synthetic dyes are cheap by comparison. They are generally direct dyes requiring no pre-treatment of the wool and are easy to use by non-specialists. And these features alone made them quick to be accepted, even if the results were fairly horrible, with colors that, if not correctly used, could run and bleed when the carpet was washed. Now to the second question. What is it about the dyes themselves that makes them seem harsh and discordant compared to the traditional dyes? I want to look a little more deeply into those very bright colors. And here I'm specifically leaving out of the discussion the so-called, well, the actually called day-glow colors, which convert ultraviolet light that's invisible into visible light, and so reflect more light into the eye than a normal dye or pigment, and so appear extremely bright. This is the way that optical brighteners also work. I mentioned earlier the problem of the hot red that troubled me. Now, if you take an extremely intense, bright, highly saturated color and analyze the spectrum of reflected light, you get something like this. The reflected light is confined to a rather narrow spread of wavelengths. If the color is less saturated, the reflectance spectrum looks more like this, with a much broader spread of wavelengths. So hue purity, or degree of saturation of the color of a sample of dyed wool, is a measure of the spread of wavelengths received from the surface of the fibers by the eye. The narrower the spread, the more saturated the color. When a color is very unsaturated, it can be difficult to describe exactly what color it is. I want to compare the hue purity or saturation of some natural dyes with some synthetic dyes. Now, a lot of work has been carried out recently analyzing the chemical composition of traditional dyestuffs using thin layer chromatography and high-performance liquid chromatography. And this has revealed the complex chemistry of many plant substances. The dye plant madder, which has been mentioned already, Rubia tinctoria, for example, is the source of an amazing array of red colors from apricot, rust red, through brownish red, and bright scarlet to purple. The great number of variations is made possible by changing the temperature, the calcium content of the dye bath, and by pre-treating the wool with different mineral compounds, or mordants. This great range of colors is possible because there is no single chemical responsible for the red color, analysis reveals that the madder plant yields 3 major and as many as 15 minor dyestuff components. The complexity of this chemical soup causes the light reflected from the surface of madder-dyed wool to include a spread of wavelengths, which means that the reds will tend naturally to be fairly unsaturated. In contrast, the synthetic dye alizarin, supposedly synthetic madder, contains only one of the numerous dye-producing chemicals in the dye plant. So it reflects light in a much narrower band of wavelengths, and the same is true of many synthetic dyes, which produce brilliant saturated colors having a narrow spread of reflected wavelengths. In nature, one generally finds gently undulating reflectance spectra rather than sharp spikes, and it so happens that almost all the commonly used plant dyestuffs naturally yield colors that are not highly saturated. So what do we learn from this? I think there is beginning to emerge from these observations a principle of color harmony. The question of what constitutes color harmony is a matter that has fascinated artists, scientists, and philosophers for centuries. And Goethe has been mentioned twice. He considered his theory of color harmony one of his most important works. But I think it's true to say that there are still no universally agreed rules of harmony of color analogous to those of music. I'm sure there are actually many principles, but the principle that I'm proposing is that a color ensemble is perceived as harmonious when there is a balance between the level of saturation of the colors used. When one color is markedly more saturated than the rest, the eye and brain registers the effect as discordant, unless it is used in very small amounts, when it can have a jewel-like effect. Now, it turns out that nature is on the side of the craftsman dyer, because the nature of the naturally occurring dyestuffs and their complex chemistry. But I did say that almost all the commonly used plant dyestuffs naturally yield colors that are not highly saturated. There is one major exception, the yellows. Now, you may or may not agree that this is not an entirely successful color ensemble. The large concentration of bright yellow in the center of the carpet looks as if there are great holes in it. Bright yellow is acceptable, but used in smaller amounts. The craftsmen and craftswomen in the past understood this problem, so they mellowed the naturally occurring sharp yellow by adding either copper salts or a little madder to the dye bath to reduce the saturation and broaden the spectrum of reflected light. Some carpets do use quite a lot of yellow. Still looks a bit too yellow to me, but the result here is relatively successful because the yellow is much less saturated. And this is also a good example of the use of a light-dark contrast. My observations and conclusions are that the dyers and weavers in the past were generally interested in clear, bright, stable colors, which after centuries of experimentation, they had largely succeeded in producing. Those who used the colors took advantage of various devices, such as color contrast, light and dark contrast, and color separation lines, to enhance the colors available to them. The use of hand-spun wool ensured subtle variations in color, called abrage, which gives them a life and beauty which is lost with the use of machine-spun yarns. Nature was generally helpful to the dyers in that the complex chemistry of most natural dyestuffs produced colors that were not highly saturated. they were intuitively aware that evenness of saturation was one aspect of color harmony, and that sharp differences, except in very small amounts, were to be avoided. For this reason, they deliberately reduced the naturally occurring high saturation of their yellow dyes by adding a little red. Overall, the craftsmen in former times achieved remarkable results, and it's a testament to their skill that the Impressionist painters in the second half of the 19th century, who were experimenting with the use of color, were both fascinated and impressed by the way color is used in carpets. And Gauguin is reported to have said, "You painters who ask for a technique of colors, study carpets. There you will find everything that is knowledge." Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was a wonderful exploration of not only of carpets, but also a masterful way of bringing us back to the present at the end. Do we have a couple of quick questions before we break for lunch? Olga.
Thank you very much, John, for very, very interesting paper. I would like to ask you a question about luminosity of carpets. Of course, everyone who's ever seen a Persian silk carpet knows how different it looks from a wool carpet. And I'm wondering whether that luminosity has to do only with, of course, the quality of the fiber of silk, because it's so much thinner, and of course you'll have many more knots per square inch, a square centimeter, than in wool. But does silk fiber absorb colors in a different way? Or why do we perceive silk carpets with such incredible intensity and saturation of hue, but also so luminous?
Yeah, there is a problem here, because actually the color of carpets is perceived both by reflection and also by transmission. And the colors of silk are perceived more by transmission than wool. I don't quite know how to answer your question. The silk carpets are problematic because depending on which way the light falls on them, they look completely different. When the light shines into the pile, you see the color, and when the light is reflected from the pile, you see a much brighter effect. The other thing is that the way the silk is dyed is totally different from the way wool is dyed. The colors are actually very unstable on silk. So you get a very brilliant effect, but it's only temporary, unless it's been kept in the dark. Apropos of that, I would say completely irrelevantly that the safflower is also used as a wool dye, particularly in China, but it is unstable to light, and so it fades out. Sorry I haven't answered your question, but thank you for asking it.
Yes.
Not sure how to put this. I guess I'm beginning to worry a little bit. Based on the first talk this morning, and then now yours now, about a sense of color as a static entity. And I guess I want to say the kind of scientism that I'm getting from your talk. So the description of color in terms of innate color sensibilities, that there's a principle of color harmony. And my basic question, I guess, is you describe the artist as seeking certain effects, that's what artists throughout time are doing. They're experimenting with color to create certain effects. I wonder what you would say to someone who would say that really the point of work of art is to create certain meanings. And that what I'm thinking of in terms of Bloom and Blair's presentation yesterday is that color has meaning that changes over time. So for instance, what I discovered last night was that blue meant two wildly different things by the same culture over time, which seems to make a lot of sense to me. From your argument, it would seem to me that that's mistaken, that color is a static, permanent, abstract entity that means something in itself.
I like the question very much. I confess that I tend to teach my students to avoid such questions. Because the fact of the matter is that they never told us. So that when we talk about meaning, we so often project our cultural theories, cultural norms, aspects that we have cooked up without being able to actually get inside the mindset of the people at the time. So I'm afraid I totally avoid answering that question. Unless somebody else has something to say about meaning. But I don't feel able to bring any concept of meaning other than what I can simply observe, that the effect that they were able to achieve. So, sorry, don't know.
Yes, John,
Just about the time that you were becoming hypnotized with knotted carpets, I was rejecting them because they were too complex for me to understand. And like many people at that time, found the large areas of color in Kilims much more acceptable. Does that mean I am unsophisticated?
What a beautiful question. Well, how can I say? I've never quite got into Kilims. I confess I don't really understand them. There is a very popular following with Kilims because of their, how can I say, primal quality, with blocks of color that are juxtaposed in interesting abstract forms. But I think a lot of it has to do with design as much as color. I mean, the fact that you find them complex is to do with their designers rather than their color. Anyway, each one to his own.
Yes, one final question.
Thank you for such a colorful presentation. Could you please explain a little bit in terms of emergence of distinct schools in carpetography, if I'm right? Can you explain something that distinct schools are emerging in the carpets in the Muslim world? Could you please explain something on this?
I didn't understand the question.
Could you explain about the emergence of
Yeah, rise of emergence of different schools, distinct schools. Like we have what we knew earlier, that there is this Kashmiri carpet and this Iranian carpet, this carpet.
Okay,
if it
yes.
is something like that, could you please explain something on that, and what are the distinctive features of each school?
Okay, very, very briefly. The way I see it is quite simple, and that is that there is a socio-economic division of carpet production in which you have different levels of technology and different functions of the object. For example, you have nomadic carpets in which are largely utilitarian. They like primary colors, and there's a wide range of objects. You have village carpets, which are partly utilitarian and partly commercial. They are influenced by the love of primary colors, but also influenced by urban fashion because they have to sell them. Thirdly, there are urban carpets, which cater for a consumer market. These things are produced commercially with specialized labor, as opposed to the village and nomad carpets, which are produced solely by the person who makes them is also the artist, the designer, all the rest of it. In commercial carpets, you have specialized designers, specialized spinners, specialized weavers, and then you have court carpets, which are the highest technological level, which are commissioned at a high level, probably designed by a court artist, use the most expensive materials and the most sophisticated color systems. If that's any help to you, it may be, but that's a good way to look at carpets.
I think now we should turn to the practical again, and that's lunch. We will have lunch here for everyone, and then we will reconvene this afternoon at 2:30, where we have three more papers, and we will then end with a sort of general discussion. So if you didn't get your question in now, you have another chance later. And one more hand for all of our speakers.